Today I'm going to cover how to implement API versioning for both standard web API and minimal API. Why do we need API versioning? Once an API is deployed and clients start using the API, the functionality of the API is kinda set in stone. We cannot just go ahead and change the functionality as the user do not expect any change to it. So API versioning is needed to support changes to a public facing API. And usually we need to support multiple versions of the API at the same time. My strategy is to use versioning pattern that is easy for the clients to accommodate. And there are four main strategies using which we can version a web API. And they are mainly through URL, through query string, through header, and through content type. And in this video, I'm going to show all those four approaches. So for the purpose of this, I have added a couple of NuGet packages, and for the minimal web API versus standard web API, the NuGet package will be a little bit different. So for the standard web API, we'll need to add microsoft.aspnetcode.mvc.versioning and microsoft.aspnetcode.mvc.versioning.api explorer. These two NuGet packages are needed for standard API. And I'm going to show what is needed for minimal API once we finish the standard API. So right now for a standard API, I have a standard out-of-box weather controller which returns the weather information. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement the API versioning for this. Now to start with, this do not need a version, but I personally suggest everyone to start with a version with version 1.0 itself, because then it becomes easier to introduce newer version later, because your client already knows that your APIs are versioned, and whatever strategy you use, they'll start using it on day one. So let's configure the API versioning. So for configuring the API versioning here, what we are going to do is we're going to start with the builder.services.add API versioning, and that is the method or the extension method that we are going to use, which is add API versioning. And add API versioning comes up with the action using which we are going to configure how we are going to version the API. So first thing what we are going to do is we are going to provide a default API version for the API. Meaning if the customer do not pass the version through the query string or header or content type, then it is going to pick up the default API version. The URL based API version is going to be a little bit different, and it's because the API version itself is in the URL. So if you don't pass the version, you are going to get a 404. That's why it works a little bit differently. But for query string, header, and content type, if the user do not provide any version, you ideally want to provide a default version. And that is why I personally prefer API versioning through query string, header, or content type, because it becomes much more easier to support a default version. So for setup the default version, what we can do is we can use this action value and say default API version, and this is going to be new of API version, and we can give here 1.0. An API version, as you can see, can have major and minor version, and we are going to use major version as 1 and minor version as 0. And I'm going to just get rid of this namespace and add it as a using statement. So for assuming the default version, the second thing we need to set up is setup.assume default version when unspecified. So if the user do not specify the version number in query string, header, or content type, we want to assume the default version number which we just set up, and we're going to set it up as true. Next, after we set these two things up, we want to report the API versions to the user so that the user know how many versions are supported for this API. And for that, we can do setup.report API versions, and we can set it to true. And finally, what we can do is we can do setup.API version reader. And the API version reader is what strategy we are going to use for API version. Now here, if we do not specify, as you can see, the default value for this instance is query string API version reader. So if we do not specify anything, by default, it is going to use the query string. So for the time being, we are not going to specify anything because we want query string to be specified. Now let's run this application. And once we run the application, we are going to test it through Postman. And if we run, we can see we are getting the data. And we are getting the data because we said we have a default API and the version is 1.0. Now let's go and get rid of the default API version and also assume default API version. And before I do that, let me also show you that in the header, we got the API supported versions and is showing 1.0. So in the header, response header, we can see, or the client can see, what are the version of API that is supported by the API. Now, if I restart this, now if we execute the same method, we are getting an error because API version is unspecified. We did not specify any version. So if we need to do that, I'll keep this part of the code as commented and we'll go into the API. And now in the API, we are going to declare the version number for the API. And for the version number, what we can do is here, we can add an attribute called API version. And for the version number, we are going to give 1.0. That's the major and minor. And then what we are going to do is for this method, we are going to say that this method maps to the version. So we are going to say this method maps to 1.0 version of the API. So now let's run. So at this point, we do not have any default version, and we are also not assuming default version if it is not specified. Now, given that for the API version reader, by default, it is query string. So what we can do is we can pass the API version in the query string. So we can do question mark API dot version is equal to 1.0 and try to execute this. And then given that we have specified the version number in query string, we are getting back the result and it is picking up this method through this mechanism. Now let us go back and change this and set the default. And now let's try using the other types of mechanisms. So we can use setup.API version reader is equal to new of, and we can say header API version reader. And I need to add the namespace here, which is microsoft.spnetcode.mvc.versioning. And here inside the API version reader, I'm going to specify the header. And for header, I'm going to use x-version. I prefer using x- for custom header because that is a standard practice. So now we specified that we are going to use header based strategy for API version. So let's run the program again and then again go to the Postman and we'll try to execute this. Now this time we don't want to specify the API version is query string. Instead we can specify it here. So we can add x-version and where we can give 1.0 and run and we'll get this. And we'll give a version which does not exist, 1.1, and we can get the error as this is an unsupported version. And if we go to header, which is the response header, in the response header, we can see the supported version as 1.0 as expected. And in the body, we get unsupported API version exception. Now, the third way of doing this is going to be through the media type API version reader. And for media type API version reader, here also we have to provide a parameter name, and I'm just going to keep it as x-version. Now, once we do the media type parameter, we will need to pass the version number in the content type header. So now if we go here, I'm going to get rid of this, and in content type, we can do application JSON, and after that we can give x-version equal to 1.1. First, I will show that it's not working with 1.1, and I'm going to go ahead and execute, and you can see we got version not supported, and then we can change it to 1.0, execute, and we'll get the data back. So these are the three ways we can set up versioning. Now let's go ahead and create a new version of this method so that we can show two versions working. So we can go here, copy this and paste it again, and name it as get1 because we have same method, so this is not going to be supported. And I'm going to use weather forecast 1. This is a model I created here, which is weather forecast 2. So let me rename it to weather forecast 2. Here weather forecast 2, and weather forecast 2 do not have any summary, so that's the change. I got that, and I'm going to set it as 1.1, and here I'm going to add a version 1.1. Now I'm going to run the application, and there will be one problem when we just run the application, and the problem is going to be with Swagger. So we'll quickly sort the problem out, but first let me show you the problem. You can see Swagger is failing, and the reason is we have two definitions for the same method. So to change it, I'm going to go into program file, and in the Swagger gen, where we have the add Swagger gen, I'm going to add a piece of code. So in the add Swagger gen, we can use the lambda function here, and we can say c dot resolve. So you see that there is something called resolve conflict actions. So we can use that, and here we can say this dot take last. So if there are two, we want to pick up the last one. That's all. And that's about it. So if we do that, the Swagger is going to start working as expected. Though we are not going to do anything with Swagger, but this is just to show if you have conflicting method, we can just use the last one and it's just going to work. So let's go back here. Now we have two versions, 0 and 1. So if we run the 0 version or 1.0 version, we are going to get the same response as before. And then here we can come in and we can change it to 1.1 and run it again. And this time you can see we're getting a different data structure from the 1.1 version. So this shows how we can support version in a standard ASP.NET Core Web API using the versioning NuGet package provided out of box by the .NET framework. I have so far showed three ways. One is using the header, second is using the content type, and third is using the query string. Now let's look into how we can support the same thing using a URL. So for the URL here, for the controller part, what we can do is in the route we can say version v, and for the version number we will say version colon, and we're going to use API version. So now if we restart the program again, we can go back to Postman, and this time if we try to execute, we'll get a 404. But here if we say version 1.0 slash, it'll start showing up 1.0 version, and similarly if we do 1.1, it is going to show the 1.1 version response. Now next thing what we want to do is, let me first get rid of this. I don't prefer version in the URL. Now if we want to, now that we have both the version up and running, we want to deprecate the older version. So for that, what we can do is we can go here and say deprecated is equal to true. And once we do that, what is going to happen is in the HTTP header, it is going to start showing in the response, it is going to start showing that this particular version has been deprecated. So if we go here and if we get rid of this URL and enable the content type, because that's what we have configured right now, here we can see that API deprecated versions, and it is showing that version 1.0 is deprecated, whereas the version supported is 1.1. So this gives an information to the caller that version 1.0 is now deprecated, which is also a very important feature in my opinion, which is supported out of box, and it's so easy just by this mechanism. Now other thing if we want to do is, if we do not want to use these options here, we can also configure these in program itself using another option, and that is using conventions. So here what we can do is we can say, so we can set up dot conventions, and then we can basically use the conventions here. So we can say controller, and we can give this controller name, which is weather forecast controller here. So we create this. Let me add the namespace for the controller, and then we can say convention dot has API version, and here we can say new API version 1.0 com dot has API version 1.1, and then we can also have similarly convention dot has deprecated version, and we can say 1.0 is deprecated. So we are doing the exact same thing as here, but we are doing it inside of the program class or the dependency injection class. Now it totally depends on preference. For me, I prefer keeping it in the controller class because it gives a little bit better readability to the developer, whoever is going to look into the code and understand that, okay, this is what we are doing, rather than keeping everything in a centralized place. Now, for some people, this might be what they prefer. And if we run this application, we are going to see the exact same behavior as before in terms of we are going to, if we run it, we're going to see the exact same header as well as exact same body here. So we see the body, and if we go to header, we see the exact same thing. Now it says supported 1.0, 1.1 both, and deprecated 1.0. It's because we have set up both as supported. If I get rid of this one, it's not going to show this message, but this is how we can do it. Now let's get into the minimal API. And for minimal API, the first thing we want to do is we want to check what is the NuGet package that we are using. And for this one, we are using asp.versioning.http NuGet package. And then what we are going to do is, for the purpose of setting it up, we can kind of copy paste part of this code. Not everything is going to work, but we can copy this much. So we are copying the Swagger gen because we need to support that, as well as we are copying the API versioning, not the full part is what is going to be needed. So we're going to get rid of the convention part. We're just going to keep this. And for the API version, we're just going to add the namespace asp.versioning. And now we have set it up. So this is the standard thing. We are setting up a default version and we are doing everything that we did before, and we are supporting media. Now here we can support all the four. And then here we have this weather forecast. So in this application now we want to support the API versioning. So for that, what we can do is we can do dot with API version set. But for this to work, we have to declare something called as a version set. So let's declare the version set here. So for that, what we can do is we can say var version set is equal to app dot new API version set. And then to this one, what we can do has API version, and here we can say new API version 1,0. And then next thing what we can do is we can just do a build, because we are just doing one. When we add 2, then we'll support 2. And here we are going to provide the version set here. And then we can do same thing. We'll have to map it. So we are going to say map to API version. And similarly, we say new API version 1,0. So at this point, this application should work the same way as the other application. So let me set up as a startup project and let me run this application now. And it's the same weather forecast. So if we run this and try it out in Postman, we should be able to get the version 1.0, and we should be able to see in the header that it supports one version. So let's quickly run this application, and it is running on a different port. So let me go ahead and change the port here. And if I ask for version 1.1, let's start with version 1.1 and execute that. And we can see it doesn't support version 1.1. And now let's try 1.0. And we can see it is showing up the 1.0. And in header, it is showing API versions is 1.0. Now let's go back quickly and create a second method. So we're going to create the second method. We'll name it as weather forecast 2. So that we do not have any problem, and it is going to map to version 1.1, and this is going to return weather forecast 2. It doesn't have a summary. Let's keep the name consistent. Weather forecast 2, it doesn't have a summary. And then here we can go and do has API version 1,1. And then dot has deprecated version, and for the deprecated version we are going to have 1.0, and I'm going to get rid of has version of 1.1. Okay, so now if we run this, we should see similar behavior, meaning we should see supported version as 1.1, deprecated version as 1.0. And we should be able to access both 1.1 and 1.0. So now let me go ahead and execute this. And you can see supported version is 1.1, deprecated version is 1.0. We got the value for 1.0, and let me try out 1.1. And we can see we got the new data structure for 1.1. So this is all working as expected. So this is how we can implement API versioning in both standard API as well as minimal API using out-of-the-box NuGet packages. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you are new to my channel and you think you are getting value out of my channel, please subscribe to my channel And thanks so much for watching this video.